Welcome, everyone. We'll just wait a couple minutes while people are still entering. Just a few more moments. Okay. Welcome to the Oxford Interfaith Forum's final presentation on pilgrimage and festivals in interfaith contexts. Today specifically focused on the Esther Story and Purim. Please remember to keep your microphones muted for the duration of the presentations. And during the Q&A section later, you can ask questions via the chat feature in Zoom or by using the raise hand function and unmuting your microphone to speak when called upon. Our session today will be chaired by Dr. Goldingay. Dr. John Goldingay is a senior professor of Old Testament at Fuller Theological Seminary and a Church of England minister, as well as a member of the International Interfaith Advisory Board for the Oxford Interfaith Forum. As a Fuller student, I knew him as a professor who wrote both for the Academy and for those outside, producing, for example, a 17-volume set titled The Old Testament for Everyone. Dr. Goldingay, thank you for chairing this presentation today.
Thank you. It's great to be here. A famous Christian biblical theologian once commented that he couldn't see how a Christian preacher could ever take their text from Esther. If I preached on Esther, here is what I might say. First, Esther is the biblical discussion of anti-Semitism, which has been encouraged by Christian talk about the Jews being Jesus' murderers. Esther is an account of an attempt at genocide that is typological of the Jewish people's experience. Michael Fox, in his book Character and Ideology in Esther, describes the way the book speaks to him every year at Purim. And in case some people didn't realize, here in England, Purim finishes in about 10 minutes. It's finished in Israel, but it's still going in the United States. The book speaks to Fox, he says, every year because of the experience of his family in 19th century pogroms and in the Holocaust. It expresses the promise that things do not always work out in that way. Haman anticipates Hitler's comment in 1939, "I have very often been a prophet," said Hitler, "and have usually been ridiculed for it. During the time of my struggle for power, it was in the very first instance the Jewish race which only received my prophecies with laughter when I said that I would one day take over the leadership of the state, and with it that of the whole nation, and that I would then, among many other things, settle the Jewish problem. Their laughter was uproarious, but I think that for some time now they've been laughing on the other side of their face." Haman is already looking for a final solution to the Jewish problem. Second, the Esther story is an expression of the way God often works in history. It makes no reference to God, Israel, or prayer, yet its silence speaks loudly. It compares and contrasts with the story of Israel in the days of Joseph and Moses. In Moses' day, God visibly intervened, but God's acts usually cannot be seen. Even in the Joseph story, eventually God's involvement is explicitly mentioned, but it's not mentioned here in Esther. The story illustrates the themes of wisdom expressed in Proverbs, and the characters embody wisdom and folly. Esther encourages Jewish people to take responsibility for their destiny in the conviction that God is at work behind coincidences and chance. The whole story hangs on the king's sleepless night. Thirdly, the story reminds us of the realities of power in the world. It's not about what should happen, but about what does happen. It's not what you know that counts, but who you know. The males have power in this story, or do they? The king turns out to have no power over Vashti. The men assume that she will encourage rebellion among the other wives in Persia. Esther turns out to have power in another sense, by using the system rather than defying the system, though the book does close with Xerxes and Mordecai. But the fact that women have usually had to survive and exercise power out of a position of structural weakness makes a woman an appropriate image for the position of the Judahite people in the dispersion. Fourthly, for Christians not least, the book of Esther draws attention to the theological significance of the Jewish people. One can apply its principles to the church, its principles concerning the way God operates, but in itself, it's about God's relationship with Israel and God's preserving of Israel. Wilhelm Fischer wrote on Esther in 1939, when the Holocaust was about to happen, and commented that the most offensive truth in all Revelation is the fact that God had connected himself indissolubly with Israel's history. And he pointed to the significance of that motif in Paul's letter to the Romans. He notes that it is through the Jewish people that we Christians all receive salvation. Jesus Christ is the fulfiller of the promise of the book of Esther, he said. Given Christian sympathy with the Palestinians, at least in Europe nowadays, it's important for us not to lose sight of that point. Fifthly, the Esther story shows how if you want to survive, you better learn to laugh. In a typically Jewish way, it encourages Jews to cope with adversity by laughing at their foes and at themselves. So humor runs through the story. Vashti and Esther as sex objects, the 6-month banquet, the 8-story high gallows, the year's preparation for entering the harem, Haman's ending up honoring Mordecai, the king's assumption that Haman is raping Esther when he's actually begging her for mercy, the fact that the only people in danger are those who attack the Jews, and 75,000 of them do. And in that connection, the ultimate irony that the Jews let themselves be drawn into the massacre that they have managed to escape, as Stan Goldman points out. But irony is always dangerous, and readers usually don't get it. There will be lots for a Christian preacher to talk about in Esther. But now we shall hear, first of all, Adam. Professor Adam Silverstein works in the Department of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies in the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He specializes in the history of the Middle East, from late antiquity until the Middle Ages. Most of his research is comparative, focusing on Islamic cultures within broad historical contexts. He studied at Cambridge and did a PhD there. Following a British Academy postdoctoral fellowship, he was a lecturer in Oxford and as reader in Abrahamic religions at King's College London until his arrival in Israel in 2012. He joined the Department of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies in 2021. His publications include a book on postal systems in the pre-modern Islamic world, a book on Islam, a very short introduction to Islamic history, and most significant for us, a book called Veiling Esther, Unveiling Her Story, the reception of a biblical book in Islamic lands. Adam.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you for inviting me. It's a great honor. With particular reference to this talk, there are 3 points about myself that I thought I should raise that are of relevance. The first is that I spent 5 years of my professional life at the Oriental Institute at the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies, and I regret that I didn't have any interaction with the Oxford Interfaith Forum, but better late than never, I suppose. The second is that I've spent the past 15 to 20 years of my life working on Esther as an academic. My first article on the subject came out in 2006. But third, and perhaps just as important, for the past 4 decades since I was a 5-year-old, I've been celebrating Purim and aware of the Esther story from within. So this is something that I've been thinking about for quite a long time. And what's incredible is that despite all that thought and reflection, I find myself changing my mind about Esther fairly frequently, and not just about the details, but actually about some of the big questions about the book itself. This means two things. First of all, if you've heard me before, if you'll hear me in the future, I apologize if I contradict myself. I'm constantly reassessing what I think. And secondly, about the book of Esther itself, as we'll see, it's a very slippery book. It's a story that can be open to many interpretations, all of which are equally persuasive. So with that, with those disclaimers out of the way, I want to explain in this talk why Esther never really came to be what I would say interesting in Islamic contexts. And by interesting, I'm referring to the fact that historically, the book has generated some very strong feelings. It's wildly popular amongst Jews and certain Christian communities in history, but it's also generated some sharp criticism, not mostly, but not exclusively amongst other Christian communities. In Islamic cultures, by contrast, although the book or the story was known, it didn't really generate interest at all, at least not until recently. So I'll start with the counter argument, the reason why perhaps we should expect there to be some sort of overlap in interest between the Esther story in Purim and Muslim cultures. In 2008 at Yarmton Manor, I gave a talk entitled Haman's Contribution to Jewish-Muslim Relations. The basic idea is that there were documents from the Cairo Geniza from almost exactly 1,000 years ago, which describe Muslims participating in a Purim celebration in Cairo with Jews. I'm embarrassed to admit that I took that basic statement and stretched it out into a 45-minute talk. But the basic idea is that Haman is indeed a villain in Islamic culture too, and he appears in the Quran 6 times. Now, anyone who appears in the Quran, Islamic scripture, is likely to generate the interest of Muslim exegetes and Muslims themselves. So it's hardly surprising that Haman is a focus of interest in Islam generally, and his biography was filled with details taken directly or indirectly from Jewish and Christian traditions. Moreover, not only is Haman interesting, but as I said, he's a villain, and this is not a given. For instance, Alexander the Great, who's a great hero in many cultures, in pre-Islamic Iranian civilization, was known as Alexander the Accursed. And Abraham, in Zoroastrian sources, was known to be something of a theological troublemaker. So the fact that a character is shared does not necessarily mean that the acceptance or reception of this character overlaps necessarily. So heroes and villains can unite or divide people, and sharing Haman, not just as a character, but as a villain amongst Jews and Muslims, may explain why Muslims were participating in this Purim celebration 1,000 years ago. And we would, on this basis, be forgiven for assuming that just as Haman was shared, the Esther story in general was shared by Muslims. But now, in the next 15 to 18 minutes, I'll explain why this wasn't the case. There are 3 reasons why this is so. And before I get to them, I just want to explain something about that Geniza Purim celebration from a millennium ago. As it's well known, Purim celebrations tend to involve drinking alcohol. And as it's equally well known, Muslims do not drink alcohol. So either the Purim in question was unrepresentative, or the Muslims in question were unrepresentative. But either way, such accounts are very much exceptional rather than typical. I wouldn't wish to exaggerate their importance for wider issues. But back to our topic, why Esther has never really fit into Islamic contexts. So the first reason is that while it's true that Haman does appear as a villain in the Quran, I've been careful not to say anything else about his portrayal there. In fact, while he is a villain, an enemy of the Israelites, he's described in ways that might surprise you. And here are a few key verses. I will share the screen. Hopefully this will work. Here we go. Indeed, this is from the 28th Surah, chapter of the Quran, Al-Qasas, the stories. Indeed, Pharaoh arrogantly elevated himself in the land and divided its people into subservient groups, one of which he persecuted, slaughtering their sons and keeping their women. He was truly one of the corruptors. But it was our will to favor those who were oppressed in the land, making them models of faith as well as successors. and to establish them in the land, and through them show Pharaoh, Haman, and their soldiers the fulfillment of what they feared. Another context, again in the same chapter, tells us, Pharaoh declared, "O chiefs, I know of no other God for you but myself. So bake bricks of clay out of clay for me, O Haman, and build a high tower so I may look at the God of Moses, although I am sure he is a liar." And a third context that I'll quote, and then I'll return to the talk. "We also destroyed Korah, Pharaoh, and Haman. Indeed, Moses had come to them with clear proofs, but they behaved arrogantly in the land, yet they could not escape us. So we seized each people for their sin. Against some of them we sent a storm of stones, some were overtaken by a mighty blast, some we caused the earth to swallow, and some we drowned. Allah would not have wronged them, but it was they who wronged themselves." Zoom out, okay, or stop share. So the evil Haman in the Quran was, or is, an advisor to Pharaoh in Egypt who opposed Moses and sought to build a building or a rebellious tower between the heavens and the earth. In other words, whereas the mere existence of a villain called Haman in both the Bible and the Quran points to commonality, the differences between the two Hamans are so significant that one might actually interpret Haman in the opposite way, as an example of how different Jewish and Muslim scriptures are. Moreover, Haman's portrayal in the Quran has long been the topic of debate between Jews and Christians on the one hand and Muslims on the other, with the former arguing that Haman's mistaken, quote unquote, placement in the Muslim scripture alongside Pharaoh proves that the Quran is not of divine provenance. And I wanted to share the screen again and show you two quotes from few hundred years ago about how Haman could be deployed in this way. The first comes from 1450 CE. Pedro de la Caballeria, a crypto convert to Christianity from Judaism, has the following to say about Haman in the Quran. And again, these are not my words. "This madman, the Prophet Muhammad, makes Haman to be contemporary with Pharaoh, which how falsely and ignorantly it is said, all who understand the Holy Scriptures can declare, and he and his followers, like beasts, must be silent." A couple of hundred years later, Father Maraccio, confessor to Pope Innocent XI, published his annotated translation of the Quran to Latin and had the following to say: "Mahomet has mixed up sacred stories. He took Haman as an advisor of Pharaoh, whereas in reality he was advisor of Ahasuerus, king of Persia. He also thought that Pharaoh ordered construction for him of a lofty tower, from the top of which he could see the God of Moses, which if true, would be inferior to him. There is no doubt that he borrowed the story of this tower from the story of the Tower of Babel. It is certain that in the sacred scriptures there is no such story of the Pharaoh. Be that as it may, Mahomet has related a most incredible story." I will stop share. Such deployments of Haman and interfaith debates have caused much friction ever since. And it's worth pointing out, however, that some more modern observers have taken Haman's appearance alongside Pharaoh in the opposite direction. Rather than seeing in this an historical error in the Quran, Dr. Maurice Bucaille saw it as a miracle. I will share the screen again. Just drag this down. Maurice Bucaille, here. He even has a Wikipedia entry. The story goes that this French physician and amateur Egyptologist discovered that in ancient Egypt, a functionary by the name of Haman served as Pharaoh's chief architect. To Bucaille, seeing as hieroglyphs were unintelligible in 7th century Arabia, the only way the Quran could have known that there was a Haman who was an architect for Pharaoh was if it were written by God himself. Accordingly, he embraced Islam. Now, naturally, I will not weigh into this mistake or miracle debate, but I just wanted to point out quite how influential personal interpretation and perspective can be in reading scripture in general and in reading Esther's story in particular. So perhaps it goes without saying by now, but I will say it anyway. Having placed Haman in Pharaoh's Egypt, the Quran does not actually mention the rest of the Esther story. We hear nothing of Esther, Mordecai, or the rest of the crew. And this is not a good start. The second problem for Esther's integration within Islamic cultures and civilizations is that the pivotal moment in the entire Esther story, specifically Mordecai's refusal to bow to Haman, despite the fact that all other functionaries at court complied with the king's order to do so, does occur in the Quran, but in a completely different context. On multiple occasions, the Quran tells us that when God created Adam, he commanded the ministering angels to bow before Adam, all of whom complied, with the exception of Satan, who is punished for his disobedience. I will share screen again and show you one example of this. Here we go. Surely we created you, then shaped you, then said to the angels, prostrate before Adam. So they all did, but not Iblis, Diabolos, or Satan, who refused to prostrate with the others. Allah asked, what prevented you from prostrating when I commanded you? He replied, I am better than he is. You created me from fire and him from clay. Allah said, then get down from paradise. It is not for you to be arrogant here. So get out. You are truly one of the disgraced. Again, this episode recurs multiple times in the Quran. And the follow-up is that, of course, Satan and God place bets, sort of like in the first chapter of Job, where Satan tries to trip up mankind thereafter, and God tries to show that we're actually generally good. So the analogy with the Esther story is obvious. The king ordered his courtiers to bow to another figure. All agreed, save a single character, whose fate was sealed by this refusal. The disanalogy is that in Esther, the disanalogy with Esther is just as interesting, however. Whereas in Esther, Mordecai is a hero for disobeying the king. In the Quran, it is Satan, the rebel, who is the refusenik. And although it's not within my remit to mention Christianity here, and I will leave that to Jill, I'd just like to point out that the story of God commanding the angels to bow to Adam was very popular in Christian circles, occurring in various versions of the life of Adam and Eve during late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. This is because the typological significance could be read into the count, with God being the father and Adam being the son, to whom prostration is legitimate. In any case, just as Jews and Christians reading the accounts of Haman in the Quran tended to assume that they contain details from other contexts misplaced in stories about Pharaoh, Muslim readers of Esther could be forgiven for thinking that the central scene of the story, which provoked Haman's genocidal plot to begin with, contains details from other contexts misplaced in Esther. The third and final problem is one of context and genre. It is well known that Esther is a diaspora story. What precisely its message is to diaspora Jews is something that scholars debate. Is it about the success of a wise courtier in the diaspora, or is it about the need to accept the cruel truth that Jewish life will be diaspora-based? Perhaps the message is that Gentile rulers in the diaspora are buffoons, or maybe it is Persian law that is being mocked, intimating that when in doubt, Jews should go with Jewish law rather than the empire's rules. Maybe Esther is about the fact that God exists in the diaspora, but he is in hiding. Whatever the case may be, there was simply no comparable context for Muslims until the early modern period. Muslims lived in Islamic lands. Islamic law was written from the perspective of a ruling culture, not in exile. While Jews peddled such concepts as the law of the land is the law, Muslims did not require such a solution to exile life because there had been no problem that needed to be solved. Anyone familiar with both the Judeo-Christian and the Muslim accounts of sacred history knows that, on the whole, the narratives overlap. The very idea that the world had a beginning, that it will have an end, and that in between, history is being played out is itself not a given in world cultures. Moreover, the middle bit, the history part, is basically a shared story. Adam and Eve, the flood, the Tower of Babel, Abraham, the patriarchs, Joseph brings the Israelites into Egypt, Moses takes them out of Egypt, the kingdoms of David and Solomon, and so on and so forth, are all part of the Abrahamic narrative. It is precisely because the general outlines, even details of the larger narrative are shared, that the differences about the Esther story stand out so starkly. To be sure, many Christian readers of Esther throughout the ages have had reservations about it. What is its theological message, if any? Does it even deserve a place in the Bible? But even the less enthusiastic Christian and other Jewish readers accepted the basic, even these less than enthusiastic Christian and other Jewish readers accepted the basic outlines of the story as it was told in Esther. Muslims, by contrast, believe Haman to have been in Pharaoh's Egypt, and Satan, rather than Mordecai, to have been the one to refuse the royal command to bow to a human. And perhaps most importantly of all, even if Muslim audiences were to suspend their disbelief, so to speak, and accept that it was Mordecai who refused to bow and it was in Achaemenid Persia that Haman operated, there was no diaspora bookshelf on which Esther could be placed in pre-modern Islamic civilizations. point out that interfaith relations are often built only when the initial celebrations a millennium ago
You've gone
tells
silent.
us something about Jewish. Haman was. I've gone silent. Hear me now?
Yep.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I don't know where you
Go
stopped.
back go back three or 4 minutes, Adam.
Okay. So I was summarizing the common historical narrative: Adam and Eve, Noah's flood, the Tower of Babel. The basic narrative is shared, and the fact specifically that the Esther story is one of the details in this Abrahamic narrative that isn't shared is what stands out so starkly for me. Had you heard that part? What's that?
Yeah.
Yes. So again, there were three differences that I was trying to highlight. Haman being in Pharaoh's Egypt, the refusal to bow motif being about Satan and not about Mordecai, and the fact that there's no diaspora context in which this Esther story could be placed within Muslim civilizations. And I just wanted to conclude with a short paragraph, and we'll move on to Jill before my internet acts up again. I would just like to point out that interfaith relations are often built and judged on the basis of commonalities and shared ideas, and that is great. But it is only when these relations and initiatives endure despite dissimilarities between the religions that we can judge the relations to be robust. Muslim participation in Purim celebrations a millennium ago tell us something about Jewish-Muslim relations, not because Haman was shared, but despite the fact that he was not. And I will stop there. Thank you for your invitation, and thank you for your attendance.
Thank you, Adam. That was fascinating. And we were talking before we started about how much people knew about Esther. I'm sure that none of us knew very much about Esther in the context of Islam. So that's been instructive and interesting for us all. Jill Middlemas is a professor in the University of Copenhagen Theology faculty. She has a DPhil from Oxford, and she conducted research in the Oxford Centre for Hebrew and Jewish Studies, as well as in the Faculty of Oriental Studies and Theology, where she taught until 2007. Her doctoral thesis, published in the Oxford Theological Monograph series as The Troubles of Templeless Judah, led to further research and publications on the history, the literature, the anthropology, and the theologies of the homeland of the Babylonian exile and diaspora. In more recent years, she's focused on aniconism, the image of God, and metaphorical language for God. She published an introduction to the Book of Lamentations last year, and she has a commentary in press on the Book of Esther and the editions. Both place scholarly work in conversation with postmodern questions related to gender, minority, and post-colonial issues, amongst others. She's currently writing a book to present approaches and uses of the Old Testament in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, entitled Whose Bible Are You Reading? Rewritten Scripture and the Old Testament in the Abrahamic Religions. Jill, unmute.
Yeah, thank you, John. My presentation will not be probably so interactive as Adam's. I have prepared for you all a PowerPoint presentation. If I can just, my share screen button is not working right now. Oh, there it comes. In recent years, I have become very interested in what I call reception archaeology, which is finding traces of the Old Testament or the Bible in culture. And so part of my lecture today is, as you can see in the subtitle here, the circulation of the scroll in antiquity and modern times. And I've entitled it Embracing Esther. So let me start by saying that the story of Esther has been a source of inspiration for communities of faith from antiquity until today. Nevertheless, it remains a controversial book in Judaism and Christianity, as Adam alluded to. The most problematic portions of the story, you all will know, include Mordecai's refusal to bow before Haman in chapter 3, and the Jewish fighting in chapters 8 and 9. Whereas Jewish interpreters have been uncomfortable with the absence of God in the story and what could be taken as anti-Gentile sentiment celebrated at the Purim festival, Christian theologians from the time of the Protestant Reformation and after the Enlightenment have frequently condemned the story for its intense Jewish nationalism and particularism, lacking in the principles of religiosity and shot through with vengeance, pride, self-exaltation, religious arrogance, narrow-mindedness, and even bloodthirsty revenge, just to cite some of the phrasing that you find. There continues to be hostility to the book, as well as questions raised particularly, but not exclusively in Christian circles, as to its inclusion among authoritative scripture for persons of faith. The focus of this presentation is on the reception and adaptation of the Esther story, how it spoke to Jews and Christians in antiquity, as well as its malleability, but also perversion in modern times. I will conclude with some remarks about how I regard the significance of the story of Esther today and its role as part of the canon. You all have just seen my screen shift, I hope, which should now say Reception in Judaism and Antiquity.
Yep.
Okay, good. The Scroll of Esther presents us with an excellent example of the development and also the reception of scripture within invested communities of faith. This is not to suggest that I believe a canon existed at the time, but rather to point to the circulation of books considered authoritative in antiquity. The scroll or the Book of Esther is the story of a Jewish heroine, Esther, who risks her life to save the Jews and her foster father Mordecai, whose lives are under a sentence of death in Persian diaspora, authorized by the prime minister of the empire, or vizier, Haman, in the Hebrew text. Sorry, I was just letting Adam in. And he's also called Ammon in the Greek. The events of the story provide the biblical basis and authorization for the celebration of the festival of Purim, which is one of 3 festivals, the others being the 9th of Av and Hanukkah, that are not found in the Torah. The story was translated into Greek during the Hellenistic period and circulated in antiquity among diaspora Jews. 2 Greek traditions are extant, the Greek Old Testament and the Alpha text. Each represents a distinct translation of a Hebrew version of the Esther story that departs from the Masoretic texts. In contrast to the Hebrew Esther, they include over 50 references to God and 6 large blocks of new complementary material, conventionally referred to as the additions. There is much scholarly debate about the relationship of these 2 Greek versions to each other and to a Semitic original. I've dealt with this elsewhere, and so I will not talk about it here. The additions contain extra material that reframe and supplement the Hebrew Esther. And just to recap what I have shown elsewhere, the effect of the additional material is that they illustrate the continuing involvement of the God of the biblical story with the Jewish people in history, and even the determination of the course of history. 2, they align the Esther narrative with the biblical norm, what I have referred to elsewhere as buttressing its biblical bona fides. And 3, they show how God's involvement is unfolding in the present life of the community. In so doing, the communities that inherited the story of Esther understood it to be part of their traditional heritage. And lastly, they provide role models in pietistic observances to emulate in diaspora or elsewhere. The revisions of the Greek Esther showed the alignment of the story with biblical literature that circulated among Jews in antiquity, and that their story was part of the unfolding revelation of biblical tradition, with its promises of divine commitment and salvation. One of the more interesting examples of a community reinterpreting the traditions of biblical Israel for their own circumstances is found in Esther's prayer in edition C. And now they are not satisfied that we are in bitter slavery, but have covenanted with their idols to abolish what your mouth has ordained and to destroy your inheritance, to stop the mouths of those who praise you, and to quench the glory of your house and your altar, to open the mouths of the nations for the praise of vanities. And it continues. Here, Esther is shown to equate the Jews with the promised land, the temple, and the altar, such that these are no longer sacred places, but references to an elect people, whose destruction would coincide with the loss of witnesses to a God sovereign over all peoples in history. The thought expressed in the Greek Old Testament is striking when compared to the Alpha text, which also circulated in Greek in antiquity, in which Esther refers here to a series of places, and then the people sacred to the deity. In comparison to the Alpha text, the Greek Old Testament regards the sacred sanctuary and the altar as the Jewish people themselves, who witness to God's presence and majesty in the world. For comparison, you can look at Psalm 30. I thought about in reference to this. In so doing, the thought aligns with that of the Essenes and the early Jewish Christians, who regarded their communities of the faithful as temples or sanctuaries. Now I want to move on to Europos. The Esther story has also found resonance with the Jewish community in Dura, Europos, which is a synagogue located in northeast Syria that was covered over in 256 CE and rediscovered in 1932. At the site of the Jewish synagogue in the 3rd century CE, the Esther story is captured on the west wall that faces towards Jerusalem. As you can see here, this is a picture of the west wall. And it is placed next to the Torah shrine. There. The most significant and holiest place in the synagogue, and where the Shekinah resides, according to one interpreter, although I wanted to ask if this is true. And it's also the place towards which the worshippers would face during the recitation of the liturgy. According to Geza Derevitz, I don't know how to pronounce his name, the iconography of the west wall underlines the special relationship between Yahweh and the people, as well as the presence of God through the covenant. He writes this: the central axis of the west wall thus emphasizes, 1, the importance of the cult, which is an appropriate reaction to 2, the enduring stability of the relationship between God and his people, and 3, the fulfillment of God's promises as the manifestation of God's perpetual providence. Directly to the right or the left as you face the Torah niche is the figure of Queen Esther in the Purim panel. And to zoom in, this is a copy of the Purim panel with Mordecai, Ahasuerus, and Esther. You can also see Haman here with the naked legs. Mordecai is actually the highest figure on the panel, but all of the characters, all of the figures, Mordecai, Ahasuerus, and Esther, they're all the same size. And here's a close-up of what I would like to just mention briefly. Here you see Esther seated next to her husband. Now her throne is a little bit set back, and she has on her head a crown. This crown is quite interesting. It is, if you zoom in, which I'm sorry I couldn't actually sharpen this, it is actually made up of city walls. And so Esther is shown to be wearing the crown of Tyche, who is the goddess of prosperity and fortune. And I have wondered if this is also trying to portray Esther as the queen of a city, the queen of Susa, or the queen of Jerusalem. Also interesting in this context is that opposite Esther, on the other side of the Torah niche, is the coronation of David, which suggests to me that it's picking up 2 royal figures for the Jewish community in Dura Europos. David is the archetypal king of landed Israel, with a capital in Jerusalem, and Esther as the archetypal queen of diaspora Israel. By the placement of the Esther and David panels next to the Torah shrine, both seem to be subject to the so-called law of the king in Deuteronomy 17. And I have suggested that one thing we might think about is that Esther was actually placed on the level of the Torah, which you can also see possibly in the visual effect here. There's a case that you can make for this, but I won't go into a lot of details about it right now. If any of you want to ask about it, I can give you my reasoning. But Esther is one of the books that is actually included among the Torah scrolls, and there's some other arguments that we could raise. But I'd like to go on so we don't run out of time for the reception in Christianity. It is remarkable that there's no reference to the story of Esther by the New Testament writers, except perhaps by Herod in the book of Mark. Ask me for whatever you wish, and I will grant it. And he vowed to her, whatever you ask me, I will give you, even up to half my kingdom. Herod's thoughtless use of this expansive promise led to the death of the prophet and holy man John the Baptist by beheading, which contrasts the use of the phrase by King Ahasuerus in the Esther story, which led to the salvation of the Jews through the intervention of Esther. In the context of this presentation, though, I'd like to focus on Christian appeals to Esther as a paragon of virtue. The Church Father Clement of Rome briefly mentions Esther in his writings dated to the 1st or 2nd century CE. In 1 Clement, his letter to the Corinthians, Clement highlights Esther as perfect in faith in 1 Clement 55:6. In a careful study of this passage, Janelle Peters points out that Esther is listed at the conclusion of a chapter that is introduced with a veritable roll call of earthly kings and heroes for moral instruction, of which she includes Esther. Surprisingly, another proponent of Esther as an exemplar of piety for Christians is Martin Luther. Drawing on Hans Bartke, Isaac Kalimi has demonstrated that the reformer was positive about Esther and Mordecai as role models for Christians. In Luther's view, Esther was the humble queen who approaches the Persian king at risk of her own life as pious and praiseworthy and can be used as a model of noble and courageous behavior for all Christians. That Luther was ill-disposed to the story of Esther, the victory of the Jews in the institution of the festival Purim, has been well documented. But that he was actually positive about Esther and Mordecai has not been said as much. This brings me to my next point, which is a painting found on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, dated to about 1511. Michelangelo here captures the story of Esther in one panel. On the left of the screen, you can see Esther and Ahasuerus. Esther's pointing at, Haman in the yellow. On the right, you can see the king pointing at Haman in judgment. In the middle there, Haman is bringing clothes to put on Mordecai, who's seated. And in the very middle of the passage is Haman crucified. The crucifixion, rather than the hanging of Haman, as mediated within Christian tradition, has been traced back to the Septuagint, Josephus, Jerome, and some of the church fathers. There's been a significant amount of discussion about the meaning of Haman crucified here. Is he a prototype of Christ who prefigures his persecution and unjust crucifixion? Or does his death by crucifixion portray the salvation for the Jews, just as Christians believe in the salvation brought about through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ? To figure this out, I have looked at different works by people who study the Sistine Chapel. And here you can see where this panel of Haman's crucifixion is located. It's actually in one of the four corners of the Sistine Chapel. These are the other corners. And here you have the crucifixion of Haman, the bronze servant, David and Goliath, and Judah and Holofernes. And what you find here is that the crucifixion of Haman and the lifting up of the bronze servant are next to the altar, which is the most holy place within the chapel. And they are opposite the motif of beheading, which you find with Judith and Holofernes and David and Goliath. And I want to return to the question about the meaning of the crucifixion of Haman. Malcolm Bull has argued that the design of the Sistine Chapel ceiling seems to reflect the interpretation found in the biblical exegetical study Liber Concordiae of the 12th century monk Joachim Fiore. Located above the altar in the chapel and opposite the illusion of John the Baptist, the images of the bronze serpent in the scene from Esther's book convey the crucifixion of Christ and accompanying deliverance. The figure of Jonah lies between the two, and Joachim interprets Jonah in terms of the crucifixion, and he writes, "The sea rose up against Jonah. The uproar of the Jews rose up against Christians when they kept on saying, 'Away with him, crucify him.' And the Son of Man was left in the heart of the earth, just like Jonah, for these 3 days and 3 nights." Joachim's exposition tells us that in certain Christian circles, the crucifixion of Jesus was recalled along with the Jews who condemned and persecuted Jesus. When understood this way, Haman's crucifixion on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel may be associated with linking the persecution and crucifixion of Jesus with the persecution of Christians by Jews, such that, as stated by one commentator, and I quote, "Christianity transformed Haman from a persecutor to a victim of the Jews." This is a misrepresentation of the Esther story that deserves a sharp rebuke, especially at the present time, but is certainly circulated in some circles in modern times, as we will see. Reception in modern times. You know, of course, that Martin Luther and his Von den Juden und ihr Lügen, from the Jews and their lies, counted himself and his fellow countrymen among the Gentile victims of the Jews in the narrative. Perhaps more shocking still, and actually John prefaced this, is that the National Socialists of Germany in the early 20th century drew on the Esther story in illustrating their alternative facts that proclaim that Christians in European society were under threat from the Jewish people. According to an essay by Joe Carruthers, Adolf Hitler even referred to the Esther story in an address to the Reichstag on the 30th of January 1940, in which he aligned himself with Haman and proclaimed that the Jews would not celebrate a second triumphant Purim, meaning that they would not again persecute non-Jews in Europe under his watch. It was also part of an extremely anti-Semitic film called Yud Sus that I won't talk about here. It would be remiss not to mention here that there are Jews who understand the story typologically and condemn non-Jews as Amalekites. In a recent book about the association of Purim with violence, Elliot Horowitz documents the increase of Jewish violence during the time of Purim, including violence against Christians and other non-Jews, as well as the abuse of Christian symbols. The uncritical typological application of the story of Esther in modern times draws out the violence that the story itself seeks to quell, and is, to my mind, a perversion of the story. Not all reception in non-Jewish circles in modern times was an inversion or even perversion of the meaning of the story, however. Dutch artists, theater, and poetry drew on the story of Esther for self-understanding in the 17th century. The Dutch Protestants had been in a lengthy and protracted war with the Spanish that continued from the middle of the 1500s until 1648. During this time, the Dutch felt persecuted by the bullying Spanish, and thus identified themselves with the heroes, Esther and Mordecai, and the persecuted Jews, under the threat of death from Haman and his allies. And just because I don't want to run out of time, I'll show you some of these prints. So this is The Triumph of Mordecai by Peter Lastman, a tutor of Rembrandt. In the back is the Temple of Jerusalem, quite interesting. Rembrandt himself, did a series of etchings in the 1640s, and the only one he actually took from the Old Testament is this one, the Triumph of Mordecai. And you can see in the balcony above, Esther and King Ahasuerus are looking on as Haman leads Mordecai through the streets, and the temple, of course, again, is in the background. This is another picture of, I can't see the title actually, but this is Ahasuerus, Esther, and Haman at the feast, where Haman, of course, is being judged. This is a really interesting print of Esther and the Decree of Destruction that Rembrandt did in 1637. I think she looks quite like a Viking here, but I guess it's up. Maybe she looks Dutch. I don't know. And then lastly, Arend de Gelder was one of the last people of Rembrandt, and he actually produced more scenes of Esther in his work than any of the other artists at this time. And this is one that he did of Esther and Mordecai writing their letters to the Jews, which I found quite interesting. But the Dutch were drawing on the Esther story and in framing their contemporary experiences of oppression and aggression. But I think in general, Christians in the West, at least, failed to identify with the Jews because they are identifying with the rich Persians. But that's just a surmise that I have. I'd like to end with a few conclusions. The journey of the story of Esther through time and in different communities shows how its imagery was malleable and thus able to be updated for different circumstances than those depicted in the story. The appeal to Esther by the Jews of Dura Europos should encourage us to interpret the story in the light of the Jewish diaspora and see it as an example of the experiences of life outside a native homeland and of a threatened minority community. Here we might also think of an African exile dating back to the time of the slave trade or the refugee crises of modern times. The events of the tale cannot be divorced from its setting in diaspora, and Jonathan Marguerite is right to remind us that in this world of exile, life or death, success or catastrophe is dependent on the arbitrary modes of those in power. The story of diaspora is one of possible threat, discrimination, and insecurity. When seen in this way, the violence in the story is entirely defensive, but also necessarily exhaustive, in order to quell the possibility, potential, and even appetite for violence against a vulnerable people. It is no coincidence that the Dutch Protestants could understand their circumstances in the light of the biblical story. They defended their homeland and ideals against a more powerful enemy. It is more surprising, though, that in general, Christians failed to identify with the plight of the Jews. Perhaps the recent events in Ukraine can help us to see the devastating effects of tyranny and injustice in ways to which many of us in the West can relate. Secondly, the story of Esther warns us against the abuse of the biblical literature and alerts us to the dangerous potential of alternative facts or propaganda wielded for the benefit of those who seek to use violence, discrimination, and suppression for their own agendas. As I interpret the Esther story in my commentary, there are clear instances in which the Jewish protagonists show customs and mores they share in common with their neighbors, integrate successfully in the community household in which they live, win over the Persians who empathize with them and also support them in their efforts, and bring benefits to the people with whom they come in contact, and also to the empire itself. That Esther is not a story of Jewish nationalism, but of integration and cooperation, is a message worthy of greater attention. And then just to end on this point, if we can go back to the print here from Europos. The Jews in Europos celebrated human agency in their fresco, not the war and not the festival. The focus is on the main characters of the Esther story, with prominence given to Mordecai, Ahasuerus, and Esther. It is the tradition of human responsibility that they aim to continue as they place themselves on the panel, illustrated by the 4 Roman toga-clad men and the toga-clad maidservant of Queen Esther. Let me conclude here by noting that Esther appears to be pregnant with her hand protectively on her stomach. The image stems from the earnest hope that the offspring of Esther and Ahasuerus oversees continued security and safety in diaspora. So I would agree with Marvin Sweeney, who recently has written that the Hebrew story emphasizes the human characters who take initiative. What he speaks of correctly is human responsibility. When confronted with great evil, which I would define as efforts to counter the divine decree of a stable order buttressed by right dealings and justice in society, human is called to agency and action to counter injustice and tyranny, as well as the forces of death and destruction. Thank you. Oh, let me just stop. There.
Thank you. That's more fascinating and illuminating material. So thank you very much, Jill. We will now let anybody we've got 10 minutes in which anybody wants to make some comments or ask some questions. We are coming to the end, and I need to give way back to Anastasia in order that she says goodbye and thanks. I presume you say the thanks, don't you?
Yes, yeah, I can give the farewell. Apologies that we ran out of time. It's always a good sign of a great presentation when there are more questions than can be answered. So thank you everyone for attending today. We're very grateful to Dr. Silverstein and Dr. Middlemas for their excellent presentations today, and a very special thank you to Dr. Goldingay for his immense contribution to the Oxford Interfaith Forum. We want to let you know that various international interfaith reading groups will continue to meet, and you can see their upcoming presentations by following us on Twitter or by going to our website, and I'm linking those 2 links here in the chat for you. And on our website, you can go to Thematic International Interfaith Reading Groups under Programs. And next Monday, the International Interfaith Reading Group on Psalms in Interfaith Context will meet for a presentation entitled Demanding Justice in Psalm 82. So thank you again, everyone, for coming today, and we'll hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you too. And